22nd annual Kenneth Owler Smith Symposium. It's a lot of symposia. I think this event probably ranks as the second longest running annual event for our field in the market. The first one, I think, being the PRISM Awards, which has been going on for like a million years. But it's really great to see all of you people here. It's going to be, I think, a very, very interesting evening. We only have about 8,000 slides that we're going to present to you. And then there's going to be a short but very difficult quiz immediately afterward. As you know, we're going to be talking tonight about the 7th Generally Accepted Practices study that we do here at USC Annenberg. And this has become probably the most important study in the field because of the number of participants and so forth. And we'll get into the detail. Before we do that, I'd like to have some people stand up, if I may, or wave, as the case may be. Right here we have Patricia Smith. Pat, if you would just wave your arm. And the name of this event is the Kenneth Owler Smith Symposium. Ken Smith. For those of you who don't know, Ken Smith ran the PR Studies program here at Annenberg for quite a number of years, and was really responsible for giving us the start that got us going in the direction that finds us today with the great success that we're enjoying. And Pat is Ken's widow, and it's a pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to seeing you at many Ken Smith forums in the future.
Just, I want to point out that SC was Ken's mistress. He did everything.
Did you hear that? I don't know if you heard that, but Pat said that USC was Ken's mistress. So you heard it here first, and no doubt it's going to be on the web in a very short period of time. So I would appreciate it if my full-time faculty colleagues could stand, because I know we've got some folks here. This Burghardt and Kjerstin, Jennifer Floto back there, and Jay Wong. Jay is here. Jay Wong is here. Where's Jay? There's Jay. Right there is Jay. And Matthew Levesque. Is Matthew here? Matthew is teaching, doing that silly teaching thing. Now, there's something we need to say in Jennifer's honor. Jennifer just won. Jennifer, please stand up, if you would. Jennifer just won the 2012 USC Mellon Mentoring Award, which is like the top mentoring award that faculty members campus-wide can get. So it is a major award, a major honor, and here's a round of applause for Jennifer. So let's see. How many, we have some adjuncts here. Would the adjuncts please stand up? Adjunct faculty, there's Stephen Pollack back there. Anybody else among the adjuncts? No, okay. Oh, there's Laura Jackson way in the back. Hi, Laura, nice to see you. Other Annenberg faculty? Any other Annenberg faculty here tonight? No? Okay, that's okay. Grad students and undergrad students in the PR programs, stand up. Stand up. Come on, don't be shy. Let's see. Any other Annenberg students? How about alumni? What do we have? We have some alumni. Stand up, alumni, please. Right on. It's great to have you here. Hope you enjoy the evening. And then we have some professionals, of course, from the PRSA and so forth. If you would stand up, professionals working in the field. Great to have you all here. Thank you. Thank you. And friends and family of all of the above. I know we have some friends and family, so, you know, if you would just stand up. And who have I left out? Are there any aliens, you know, people from other planets or something in the audience? I don't know. Let me introduce at this point Steve Roth. Steve, come on up here. Steve is the president-elect, the board president-elect of PRSA LA. And in addition to his role at PRSA, Steve is principal and founder of Outthink Partners, a leading communication and marketing agency specializing in the LGBT market. So, Steve, it's yours.
Great. Thanks, Jay.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Jerry. And on behalf of both myself and the LA chapter of Public Relations Society of America, I just want to thank you for having us here. We were really pleased to hear that PRSA at the national level was helpful in helping the study reach a record number of participants by senior level professionals. we're excited that we could help out on that level, and we're just really gratified for the relationship that our LA chapter has had with you guys for a long time. So we're thankful for that. For those of you who don't know about us, the Los Angeles chapter of PRSA is one of the largest chapters in the country. We have over 500 members, and we organize a lot of events, networking events, panels, professional development, you name it. And we just had our signature State of the State of PR event about a month ago, and we have a series of networking mixers planned in May, our connections mixers. We're going to have a big media panel discussion in June, so we've got a lot of good stuff going on. We invite you to check us out at our website, PRSALA.org. And for all you students in the audience, I noticed quite a few. We have a sister organization, the Public Relations Student Society of America, and USC has a chapter. In fact, I was just talking to your faculty advisor, Jennifer Floto, and she said you've got a really great program this year. So we encourage you guys to check that out as well. And you can find out more about that at USCPRSA.org. So thanks a lot for having us.
And now we get to the good part, my bar mitzvah pictures. What we're about to talk about is the 7th annual Public Relations Generally Accepted Practices Study. And I'll give you some background and then turn it over to my colleagues who will be covering some of the data. Now, we emphasize you may not be able to absorb all of this because there's a large amount of data. You can find everything in beautiful shape for download and so forth and for presentation at the URL you see up here. And if you want any additional information, write to that email address, which, by the way, I'm in the process of activating. So, you know, give us a few days to get back to you. All right, so this is where you go for additional information. A few words about the Strategic Communication and PR Center. This organization all started now about 10 or 11 years ago in a conversation that we had with a guy named Steve Harris. Steve is a graduate of this school, and for quite a number of years he was head of global communications at General Motors. And Steve made a comment one day that was kind of astonishing. He said, you know, when we do our budgeting each year, like so many companies, we don't have any benchmarks. We don't know what to start with. We have historical data within our own organizations, but we have no way of knowing what a company of our size should be spending on public relations and communications. And that like astonished us. There had to be a solution to that. And it was out of that discussion that the GAP study was born and the Strategic Communication and PR Center was born. The mission, you see it right here. We want to be a think tank for the profession. We don't want to just study the profession. We want to lead the profession, inform the profession, because, as you well know, it's going through incredible change, and we want to help guide the profession through that change by doing applied research that's really of use. And a lot of you, I'm sure, are aware of the fact that there's kind of a gap between, no pun intended, between the practice and the academy. We're trying to bridge that gap. Because it really shouldn't exist. And perhaps most importantly from an academic standpoint, everything that we learn through the GAP study then informs our graduate and undergraduate curricula. So that helps us keep everything current. That way we know that what we're teaching doesn't become irrelevant over a period of time because we know what's going on, and that stuff just goes right into the curricula. A few words about the study itself. Well, its purposes are to essentially provide actionable data that senior level decision makers can use in making their most important managerial decisions. Decisions having to do with budgets, organizational structure, staffing, evaluation, relationships with agencies, all of the key elements of a successful communications organization can rely on this data. And what we found is that over the years, it really has become probably the most often referred to source of data on all of these kinds of decisions. I was sitting at a table at a major event a couple of weeks ago in New York with a whole bunch of corporate communications types. There were 3 corporate communicators at the table. 2 of them use the GAP study on a regular basis in making their decisions. That was like music to my ears. Because they were east of the Mississippi, son of a gun. And we also want to help the academy by providing data, by providing insights that can be the subject of additional research. So it really has become now through its 7 iterations, probably the cornerstone, if you will, of applied research in the field. One of the things that made GAP VII so successful and made it unique is the fact that we formed partnerships with all of the major professional associations. PRSA, thank you, PRSA, thank you very much. This is PRSA National. The IABC, International Association of Business Communicators, the Arthur W. Page Society, and the Institute for Public Relations, which does a lot of research in the field. Never before had these 4 groups worked together on a single project. So this is a first in a whole lot of different ways, and because of their help, we reached great levels of participation in this study. Here are all the folks who are on the research team, and it's a long list of people, but I want to point out most especially the folks over here, our research associates. So let's see, is Niku here, or did she have to leave? I think she had to leave. Brenna, where are you? There's Brenna Tierney, stand up. Mia, are you here? Stand up, Mia. Jessica, you here? No? Okay. Yuang, here? No? This study could not have happened without the help of these brilliant students. And so I would like to give them a round of applause. The volume and the quality of work that they did is astonishing, and so we really thank you for that. But it was really a team effort. It was a great, highly collaborative team effort. A few words about the methodology and the response on this study. It is a study of senior practitioners, not on the agency side, all on the corporate side. No agency people. Sorry if there are agency people in the audience. Sorry about that. Maybe someday we'll do a study for you. But we want to know what's happening on the corporate side in the minds of clients and what they're thinking. The data were collected in quarters 3 and 4 of last year. We received in total more than 1,000 responses, which is like major. And we put those responses through a really rigorous kind of filtering process so that we ended up with 620 highly qualified people. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Without going into a lot of detail on the scoring, suffice to say that you tried to enter the website. Before you could get into the study, we asked you, how many questions was it, like 4 or 5 questions? More like 8. 8 questions about your level within the organization, your reporting line. Are you or are you not responsible for budgets? The size of your organization, all of that. And after they had gone through that screening, we went from 1,000 down to 620 usables. And those 620 usables, that's a record for any study done of the profession in America. This has been called, we were originally a little bit shy in how we wanted to describe this. We knew all along that it was the largest, most comprehensive study to date of senior level communications practitioners. But we wanted other people to say that. And so now it is being called by outside folks. Folks at the Page Society, folks at IABC, folks at PRSA, the most important study of the field. So we're pretty proud of that. Sample from a comprehensive list. Actually, it was more complex than that, more comprehensive than that. All 4 of those organizations basically engaged with their members, their tens of thousands of members, and encouraged them to participate. That hadn't happened before either. That's one of the reasons why we have 620 usables. And we believe that it represents, it's representative of the broad population of communication decision makers. Next steps. After this, if we survive this, we're going to go ahead and start doing a deeper dive. We're going to start doing some panels and a whole lot of other things that need to be done. Because as you see the data, it can be sliced and diced in a million different ways. It's pretty cool. You look at the roles in the organization. These are all senior folks. So over here, you've got 52% most senior communication professional in the organization. Up there, you've got senior communication professional responsible for an operating unit, a division, a subsidiary, a geographic region, or something like that. So between those 52, 62, that's like 70% are the top people in their organizations. Here you've got 27% who report directly to the most senior person and who hopefully kind of reflect that person's points of view. And 3% up there, most senior internal communications professional within the organization. Then you look at the breakdown between government, nonprofit, and so forth. We want this to be a study of all parts of industry. We want to look at people who are working in all kinds of organizations. What we're going to focus on tonight primarily are corporate respondents. Because we'd be here all night if we started including all the data for nonprofits and government agencies and so forth. But as you can see, we've got 21% from nonprofits there. Public companies, 30%, the brown on the right. Government agencies, private companies, 25% down there. So it's a really good sample of lots of different kinds of organizations. Then you look at the size of the companies that responded. A priority for this study was to get more big companies involved because they provide leadership, and what they do often serves as kind of benchmarking for what other folks do. So you can see that at the 40 billion plus level, that's 14%. 20 billion to 40 billion, 9.3, that's 23%. 23% of our respondents fall within the category of very large companies, and the rest are pretty well evenly distributed. Private companies are over there on the right. Geographic scope, we wanted to know the parameters of these folks' responsibility. And you can see on the right, 42% US or local, US national, meaning coast to coast, 21%. Multinational, meaning home country and one or two other countries, that's 10%. And then global, more than 4 countries, that's 27%. That is a much better geographic kind of response than we even anticipated, because it represents all kinds of organizations, from the local all the way up to the multinational and the global. Academic degrees, why not? We're in a wonderful university. Why not ask about academic degrees? More than 75% of our respondents have an academic degree in either journalism, PR, or communication. And remember, these are the top folks, so they have their origins. They've gotten their training in programs like this one. And you see roughly 11% in business administration. Now this is, I'm sure the folks in the back cannot read what this says, right? Neither can I. No, actually I can, and I'm gonna share it with you because it is very interesting. This slide shows characteristics of our respondents, dividing the correspondents into the corporate category, the government category, and the nonprofit category. And the one I really want to point out to you that's particularly interesting is ethical versus unethical. This question was asked on a 1 to 7 scale. Ethical, running from ethical being 1 up to unethical being 7, right? The dark red is corporate, the middle red is government, the nonprofits are gray. Notice those that say that they are the most, 6.3 versus 5.9 for government, 6.1 for nonprofits. The corporate respondents describe their organizations as being as ethical as, or more ethical than, nonprofits and government agencies, which is really interesting in an era when people are so skeptical and cynical about government. About business, so untrusting of business. Then you look at some of these others. We don't have the time to go into a lot of detail, but here's profits first, people first. Profits first is 1. People first is 7. And you see 4.0 for corporate, kind of in the middle, but a little bit more on the people first side. And then you go up here, and it's way up for government agencies and nonprofits, 5.2 to 5.4. I urge you to go to the URL that I mentioned earlier and just take a close look at this slide. It's very interesting in looking at the characteristics of these 3 different types of organizations. Some of the things that were interesting in addition to the ones I pointed out, nobody considers themselves to be particularly long-term strategic. Nobody jumps off the map, really. None of those categories describe themselves as being really proactive, really long-term in their thinking. Now, the structure of the presentation is broken down into these narratives because these are the categories of information that we focused on in the study. Burghardt's going to cover budgets through working with agencies, and then Kjerstin's going to pick up with measurement and evaluation through culture, and then I'll bring it back with excellence and best practices and let you go home, okay? And that'll be around 1 a.m. Let me tell you a little bit about Burghardt. Come on up here, BT. Let me tell you a little bit about my colleague, my wonderful colleague, Burghardt Tenderich. Prior to joining the USC faculty, Burghardt was we call him BT. affectionately referred to him as BT, was executive director for the Center of Entrepreneurship and Technology at UC Berkeley, where he lectured on technology innovation. He's also founding partner of TNT Initiatives LLC, a social media publishing and consulting firm focused on web and healthcare-related technologies. He has 20 years of experience in marketing and communication in the information tech and internet industries, both in the US and Europe. Previous positions include General Manager North America for Technology Communications Consultancy, Byte Communications, Vice President PR at Sable Systems, and Senior Vice President and Partner at Technology PR Agency Applied Communications. Applied, by the way, being an agency that was started by Alan Kelly, another alumnus of this school. So with that, Burghardt, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jerry.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Excuse me.
Can I borrow your cheat sheet so let's Kjerstin later? Great. So, now, Jerry, thank you for this excellent introduction. And now it's my job to, at first, and then Kjerstin's, to go into a great deal of findings. So this is going to be overwhelming in terms of sheer numbers and charts. Definitely there'll be a long Q&A session afterwards. So we really look forward to your questions, your comments. Some of the findings really surprised us. We hope some of them will surprise you. And we'll have a very good discussion about it after this. So diving in, here's actually the first surprise that we saw. Looking at the budgets that public corporations have available for the public relations functions, for the most part, we've really seen an increase. So with the exception of some here in the middle, we really see a pretty sharp jump from 2009 to 2011 data. And honestly, had budgets been flat over those 2 years, we would have been surprised too, because as we all know, it's been a really, really difficult time for corporate America. But in fact, we've seen budgets increase for corporations, and in particular for public corporations. Then we asked our corporate respondents about their expectations for budgets for the future. And as you can see, so the majority thinks there'll be no change, which may be decent news. And then the rest is split roughly, actually more than 25% expect an increase and only 15 a decrease. So across the board, for those of you entering the job market now, for those of you looking to secure more and greater clients, this may be actually good news, maybe telling us that we're going into a very good business cycle. For nonprofits, the picture is somewhat different. So we actually have seen, or our respondents have seen, a decline in budgets over 2009. And I would say, pretty, not substantial, but definitely a noticeable decline in budget. And this may be, again, attributable to the economy. Maybe there was less money coming on. We don't have that explanation, but we notice it as a pretty important finding. This is, again, the anticipated changes, and we see that an even larger portion of nonprofits expect no change in budget in the next year. Then we asked our respondents what they actually do with all the money that's being allocated to them. And as you can tell, about 50% of their budget goes to salaries. So it's people that make the #1 cost factor in public relations, followed by creating and executing communication programs. So I would say this looks at a very efficient use of those funds, as 75% roughly go into people plus program execution. Very interesting, we think, is this number. 8.5% of all respondents, all respondents reported on average 8.5% of budgets spent on management and evaluation of programs. And we will actually talk about this more in a little while. There's some really interesting finding as it relates to measurement and evaluation. Kjerstin will dive into that. Outside agency fees, 18%. So that's the piece of the pie, if you like, that agencies on average seem to get from our sample. And here we looked at the relationship between public relations budget and gross revenue. And in 2009, we saw that 0.03% of all revenues coming in was allocated to a PR budget. And we've seen a noticeable climb. So now it's 0.04%. And I guess as we continue asking this question over time, we'll see whether this is actually a trend or it just happened to happen this particular time. So then we did some deeper digging and found something very interesting. So we looked into, basically grouped our respondents into organizations with budget increases and organization with budget decreases. And the other thing we did, and you'll hear about this throughout this presentation, we've identified certain variables indicating success. Those variables are what you think, how your CEO, to what degree the CEO values the public relations program, and also whether you think your recommendations internally are taken seriously. So what we noticed indeed was that organizations that did experience a budget increase were more likely to score higher on these success factors. And reversely, organizations that experienced a decrease in budget were less likely to score very well on these success factors. And this is a little bit of a theme that we'll keep coming back to throughout this presentation. Okay, so much for the budgets. We then asked a whole battery of questions about functions and responsibilities. And let me share with you what it is that those of you working in industry are being asked to do. So this is a long laundry list, and just want to point out, probably not too much to surprise, corporate communication really being the core function, stable 2009 to 2011. If you look at the second one, executive communication, and in particular the third one, internal, you see very significant jumps, right? So the PR organizations are even increasingly tasked with executive communication and with internal communication. The other area that really stands out here, and I don't think it surprises anybody, is the jump in responsibility in social media. And this time around, we actually broke out social media into social media monitoring and social media participation, right? 2 years ago, we asked only one question, social media. That combined number, or that number was 53% for anything social. You can see pretty significant jumps there. Nobody is probably really surprised by it, but I think this is probably one of the first times that's being documented that PR organizations, on average, over 70% of PR organizations have budgetary responsibility for social media. Here is, if you like, the big budgetary loser, and that is marketing or product PR. So we see a significant decline. It was 61% of corporations who reported in 2009 that they had budgetary oversight over product marketing related PR, and only 50% now. We've had hours of discussions about what this can be attributed to, and one of the interpretations is that it is indeed potentially a shift to social media. It may be a function of changes in the publishing landscape, that many sort of product-specific publications were downsized, and at the same time, corporations went more direct in their communication program. Here we asked the question, which of these departments or functions share responsibility for the corporate character, the identity, and core values. So really a measure of really managing the outside and having responsibility for the outside appearance, if you like, the brand of the organization. And you can see three front runners here. No surprise, senior management, of course, very keenly aware and concerned with the overall brand of the organization, human resources scoring very high, also 80%, and then corporate communication. After that, you really see a drop, legal and the marketing/sales department, and then other functions scoring lower. So I interpret this as good news for those who want public relations to have a seat at the corporate at the corporate executive table. You know, we're right up there, very important function in managing the overall brand. On the nonprofit side, the numbers were slightly different, and let me just point out a few that really stand out to me. The responsibility for social is even higher in nonprofits than it is within the PR department than it is in corporations, and there's more findings on that coming when we dive deep into social media in particular. And also very interesting, I mentioned social media, but also search engine optimization. So within nonprofits, we see a very significant jump of PR's responsibility for SEO. By the way, we see a similar, not quite as pronounced, but definitely a jump within corporations as well. And that was another point that another finding that somewhat surprised me, that public relations is now very keenly or very prominently involved in making sure that websites are being search optimized. And if you think about this, what does this really mean to the profession that was for such a long time really driven by news? I think to a degree we're seeing a shift that PR is driven by search. This is the Googleization, potentially, of our world. People are aware that audiences are drawn to information through search in addition to news. So we basically grouped the types of responsibilities, came up with three groups. One we called the traditional one with all these responsibilities you can see here. Then there was a second group emerged with responsibility, high degree of responsibility for the digital, more new media type of activities. And the third one focused on corporate and product. So let me just dive into a little bit more of an interpretation of what this means. So one really important finding that we did by looking at these different groups that I showed a minute ago is those organizations that took on a lot of more responsibility for social and digital media, they were actually not the ones who experienced budget increases. So what this kind of means is, in addition to all the work that you have to do anyway with your existing budget, now social and digital is piling on top of it, but we haven't really found evidence that you're getting more budget for it. And the last point here I made earlier, but I think it's important again to highlight the shared responsibility when it comes to the character of an organization between the C-suite, public relations, and human resources. All right, now we're looking into social. And one of the things we had a long set of tools listed and asked respondents to what degree, so how significantly these tools are being used by the public relations department. And you see social networking being on the top. A lot of that is Facebook. I don't think anybody is surprised to that. I mean, when was the last time you saw a campaign that did not have some kind of a Facebook component to it? What I thought was very interesting, though, is that sharing and producing of online videos is definitely now a significant responsibility of the public relations department. And again, think about what that means to the job profile. Now, in addition to what we already know and can do, we need to become producers of video content, and we need to become very savvy about how to distribute it across the web. I already mentioned SEO, search engine optimization, as being very important. And then, of course, you cannot do anything without mentioning Twitter, and of course, Twitter also being used significantly in organizations. We should also point out that none of these really score higher than 4.7 on a scale from 1 to 7. So we think within corporations there is still growth for the uptake in these social media tools. And that would be sort of a prediction that when we look at this, at the GAP data in 2 years, that we would probably see higher numbers here, at least in some of these categories. So clearly these tools are on the rise. I was somewhat surprised about the pretty significant growth in blogs. I personally thought blogs had kind of died down as sort of yesterday's thing, had given way to Facebook and Twitter. And no, blogs definitely are still being used. We see a pretty significant jump over 2 years ago. So this is, if you like, this is the core of the social media tools that are being used by corporations. And I should also mention the ones that are clearly on the decline. And really, wikis and virtual world are almost becoming extinct. And I remember not too long ago where everybody in every PR organization, not everybody, I was working with PR organizations that was establishing a presence on Second Life. I was working with a client at the time that was proud of having hosted the first ever press conference in Second Life. And we all thought this was going to be the big thing. And data shows, and by the way, also 2009 data already showed it's absolutely not the case. And in terms of wikis, I think the only wiki that's really made it is Wikipedia, but it doesn't seem to be used much by others. Please.
Did you ask about some of these emerging sites like Tumblr, Pinterest, some of those at all? Did you get into any of those?
So Pinterest we completely missed because Pinterest really took off so recently when the survey had already been fielded. I don't recall whether we asked for Tumblr. Maybe we have not. And obviously as an indication how fast the world's moving, if we had to do it again, we would certainly include those. What's really interesting about the use of social media in nonprofits is not what they're doing, but to what degree, how significant the use is. And the use of social media tools by nonprofits is significantly higher than it is by corporations. And it would be great to have a discussion about why you think that is, especially those of you who work in nonprofit. Our hypothesis is it could be that budgets that are actually decreasing need to stretch further. And if you don't have money for expensive events, well, you always find somebody who can do Facebook, Twitter, and comment on blogs. So basically, a mechanism for stretching your dollars. We don't know this. That's not a finding. That's an interpretation. Oh, okay. Here, we asked now the question not about the use, but the budgetary control of social media. As you all know, and I'm sure you're having these discussions internally, is it PR that will prevail owning social media? Is it going to be marketing? Is it going to be sales? So we asked that question. And in terms of budgetary control, PR indeed scored the highest, followed by marketing and customer service. Right? But really, really followed by marketing because the gap to customer service is very, very significant. But then, first we asked for budgetary control. Now we're asking for strategic control. right? Meaning, so who actually determines programs and is responsible? And you see the gap between PR and marketing widening. So an indication here that public relations, at least for now, has taken the lead within an organization as it relates to budgetary and strategic responsibility for social. Interesting is customer service, and I think that's sort of a function to watch as we see customers of any type engaging in social media and really forcing the customer service and customer relation departments to be interested and possibly be involved in discussions as well. So if I had to guess, I would say this number is probably going to rise in the future, but time will tell. Yeah, let me, we've basically covered this. Again, here, the really interesting part, if you look at the different types of organizations and their frequent use of social media, nonprofits, private companies, government, and the public companies actually scoring the lowest, which I thought was rather interesting. Okay, I know a number of you have interests in agencies, run agencies. So we have a lot of data there as well, which is the fourth section that I'll cover before turning over to Kjerstin. Yes, please.
You said public companies are the lowest users. Is that possibly because of some of the documentation issues and stuff like that that they may be required to deal with?
Yeah, that's definitely our interpretation of it. So publicly traded companies being covered by SEC regulations, Sarbanes-Oxley, regulation fair disclosure, may be more reluctant to get involved. Also, if you think, for instance, about health companies, pharmaceutical companies, they are all very highly regulated. They also all tend to be public because you almost need to be in order to be in the market. And we know anecdotally from those organizations that they're much slower in adopting social for those reasons. Okay, so to summarize this chapter, there is some good news and there's some not so good news for agencies, if you like. And looking at this, if you look at the total percentage of budget, of total PR budget allocated to agencies, we see a somewhat continuous decline. I should point out that we chose to ask the question somewhat differently in 2011, so this jump may be exaggerated and may not be quite as steep, but nevertheless there seems to be a trend, right? That the agency share of the total PR budget seems to be declining. The good news is that overall, really the majority of corporate organizations uses agencies, and in particular if you look at large public ones, 95%, so almost all of them, use agencies. And it is the small privates where the number is just barely below 50%. And I think this is a shift over time. Before, I would say, certainly some 10, 12 years ago, small companies, certainly in growth sectors, would invest very heavily in agencies, and they probably don't do as much of that anymore, or certainly not at this point. Now, here I want to draw your attention to the left, and this is single agency of record. We have data now for 4 GAP studies stretching over 10 years. And you see an undeniable trend. In this case, we're talking about public corporations. You see an undeniable trend in the decline of the single agency of record relationship. And as those of us who've worked in agencies a long time, that's not great for agencies because these relationships tend to be very profitable. They tend to be very stable. You don't have to reinvest a lot into pitching and repitching business. So it's not necessarily a great thing. Especially if you look at how many of the number, especially if you look at the number of agencies used by corporate clients. And here we see somewhat clear upward trend, meaning corporations tend to use more agencies rather than a single agency record. So there seems to be a somewhat significant shift there. Then we asked them, okay, what do you actually ask your agencies to do? Why are you hiring them in the first place? And here are the findings. And these findings, very interesting because those here on the left that score very high fall into two very, very different buckets, right? Number one is the additional arms and legs. But then followed by providing a unique perspective, providing marketing insight, and the strategic point of view. Those are the three that everybody who works in agency, that's where you really want to be, right? Then if you look at the fifth one, it's geographic reach. And we think this really tells us that two parallel stories are going on. There may be certain spikes where companies just need more resources and they just outsource it to their agency. And maybe also geographic reach. If something happens regionally where they just don't have the expertise or the people on the ground, they invest in agencies. But then at the same time, pretty high, as I mentioned before, are those three factors, right? So two very distinct types of use. And we've looked more into this. So we conducted a factor analysis which really produced and manifested these two types of agency uses. One that we've coined strategic and the other one that we've coined tactical. But those are the types of usage that correspond with these two groups. The unique expertise, the market insight, the ability to quantify results, and the strategic point of view on the one hand, and then cheaper than hiring staff, arms and legs, we're hiring agencies because we have limited headcount on the other side. So just remember these two groups for a minute, as I'll get back to this. So here we've developed a typology of agency use. High tactical versus high strategic. Low strategic versus low tactical. And what you see here is that for the most part, we see a pretty even distribution, right? The high tactics, low strategy seems a little lower. But for the most part, this is a pretty even distribution, really telling you that there is no clear pattern of how companies are engaging with their agencies. Now, if you're in the agency business, if you're looking for good news, this is what's coming here. So first of all, there is 18% that indicate that they've become more dependent on agencies. But what's really interesting is, remember when I talked about these variables indicating success, right? How seriously your recommendations are taken by management and also positive CEO perceptions. What GAP VII showed is that the cluster of corporations that tend to use agencies in a more strategic way, they tend to score higher in these variables of success than those corporations that primarily use their agencies on a more tactical level. So I think that's a great selling point that agencies can make to their corporate clients. So maybe to summarize this, really the opportunity for agencies is on the strategic side. And for clients, it is basically in order to do best with your public relations function, use your agencies right. And that's the overall takeaway here. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Kjerstin Thorson. And Kjerstin, you want to come up here? So Kjerstin is an associate professor here in assistant professor.
Thanks for promoting me.
Anytime. Assistant professor here at USC Annenberg's PR program. And her research explores the effects of digital and social media on political engagement, activism, and persuasion. Recent research projects have investigated the video activism in response to California's Prop 8, the contributions of media use in shifting conceptions of politics among young adults, and the impact of uncivil political blogging on emotions, partisan social identity, and political participation. And prior to joining us here, Kjerstin earned her PhD from the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has also worked for a number of years in public relations as a professional, and she holds her master's from the Missouri School of Journalism. Kjerstin, over to you.
Thanks. So I absolutely promised to do this wrong, but thank you. And I'll hopefully be quick. I'm going to go through the last few sections of our data. And I beg to start with this section because I'm a research nerd, and so I'm really excited about a lot of what we found about measurement and evaluation practices among various organizations. So let me start with this one. Happily, we see a substantial increase in budgets allocated to research, to measurement and evaluation over the previous GAP. And I really think, having spent a lot of time thinking about these data and looking at what's out there, I think this is in the air, right? There's a real sense that across a lot of organizations, we're coming to value research in new ways. However, it's still kind of an open field. What this shows you is just like what BT showed you about the sort of laundry list of digital and social media practices. This is a laundry list of various tools, and we asked about more than just this, but various tools that you could use to do measurement and evaluation, right? So this is the top 10 list. And what you see here, first of all, is that nothing has blown it away, right? Nothing owns it. There's no one true research yet, as far as we can tell. And in fact, nothing's really above 5 on a scale that goes to 7, right? However, most of the things in the top 10 list are things that I think, and I'll talk about in the next few slides, as being really important ways to measure outcomes, rather than the sort of long-standing common practice of measuring outputs, right? Like just counting the stuff that we made happen. Right? So we see in particular, and you'll see this across a bunch of these slides here, that metrics for digital and social media is getting up there pretty high as well. It's pretty central in the top 10 list. Okay, so what's growing? If we see that there is increased budget being spent on research, right, and we know what the top 10 list looks like, where's the growth coming from? And it's concentrated almost entirely on these 3 kinds of research, right? Huge increases. Those are huge on the 7-point scale, I swear. It's huge increases, really, on digital and social media metrics, and also really pretty big increases on primary research, both pre-campaign research and post-campaign evaluation research. And we've actually had a lot of conversations about why this would be as well, and I think a big part of that is it's getting cheaper to do that kind of research. We have survey tools online that most of you have gotten familiar with using. There are services out there that provide you with sample in a lot of ways. You can do digital focus groups and things like that. There's a lot more opportunities to do that kind of research right now, and we're excited to see those practices growing. So what does the core look like right now? We define sort of core research practices as those scoring above 4, sort of above the point of neutrality on this 1 to 7 scale. And what you can see is this is the core right now based on 2011 data. If you look over to the left, most of them are flat, but metrics for digital and social media has exploded into the core of research practices, right? Which we think is pretty cool, and we're glad to see it up so high. Here's the same data for nonprofits, and I want to spend a lot of time on the differences with this chart. One of the differences that's not as good is that you see a lot more of the sort of classic outputs measures in there. Things like total impressions, total number of clips being higher on that list. However, you also see that metrics for digital and social media are higher, right? And that's just like BT said, we see this across the board, that nonprofits are more likely not only to be doing interesting things with social media, but also more likely to be measuring them. So still pretty high. Nothing's declining, right? Which for the things that maybe aren't so awesome is too bad, but it's kind of an exciting time for research, and for me, for people who like research a lot, this is a very exciting time to see that really we're looking at a big commitment to doing it, and still some unsettledness in terms of what the best practices are. Okay. So as with before, laundry lists of tools are nice, but what we wanted to understand is, do these tools and practices hang together in ways that help us understand, do organizations have different approaches to research, right? Are there ways of researching that goes together that are different from other ways? And in fact, there are. I like to talk about these as flavors. These are flavors of research. There are 4 flavors of research. It's a limited selection. And there are these, right? Essentially, research that's based on understanding stakeholder outcomes, research that's driven by strategic insight, research that, and this is, by the way, this third category is the lowest, the least practiced, perhaps the hardest. Research designed to understand the effect of PR on bottom line outcomes. And then the fourth kind is research that's focused on outputs, right? Again, this is research that's focused on counting the stuff that we make, which is, of course, the easiest, right? But maybe not always the most insight-producing types of measures. So when we take those 4 flavors and we say, are these flavors related to what we know from the data are measures of success, right? How organizations think about their reputation, whether or not organizations evaluate them as being successful, and we have a very clear finding. And we're just showing you one subset of this. If you want to hang out with me later, we can go over lists and lists of ways in which this is true. Doesn't that sound awesome? I'm sure you're all going to take me up on that. Okay. So, but this is one of the ways, right? What we see quite clearly is that the more you measure outcomes, the more successful you feel you're being, right? And this is true across the board. The more you measure outputs, the more it doesn't really do much for you, right? In some cases, it even can hurt your standing within the organization or the way that you feel you're valued within the organization. Of course, we want to count the things that we make. We're not saying that's not good, but counting the things that you make in the absence of trying to understand their end impact seems to be a less valuable way to do research. Yeah?
I'm sorry, I'm missing something here, which is I'm not hearing, and maybe I missed it, that you're measuring leading indicators so that the progress of what's happening inside your campaign is actually being measured and you're reshaping and readdressing it. Is that what's going on as well, or in fact leading indicators are not what's being measured by corporations?
What would that measure look like?
KPIs? Key performance indicators?
I don't know. You know what? Let's say that from the Q&A when we can share our expertise about that. That particular measure is not on our laundry list, but if it's an important one, then it should be, right? I think we probably lump those in to measures that relate to the bottom line, right? So, but let's talk about that, because that'll be an interesting thing to talk about across the team of us. Okay, so the next section I want to talk about, actually the next few sections all have to do in various ways with organizations and how the PR organization within the organization is, organized. So this slide, there's a lot of information on this slide, so let me just show you the highlights. These are sort of various bits of data mashed up together. The number one thing we were interested in, because we've known for previous GAP studies it turns out to be important, is whether or not the PR function, and that's not just the person we talked to, but the PR function has a direct reporting line into the senior executive level management, right? So in this case, we see that with corporations at least, about 56, 57% have some reporting line into the C-suite. Only about a quarter of the PR functions report directly to the CEO only, but many cases, and I'll talk about this again in another slide here, in many cases, people have multiple reports. The PR function has multiple reports, about 30% of the time, and oftentimes having a multiple report means you have one report somewhere, marketing, also you have a report into the C-suite, right? And the reason I want to highlight this difference between those who report into the C-suite and those who don't, into the senior executive and those who don't, is that it turns out to be really important, right? So what we see across all of these various measures of success, how seriously you feel your recommendations are taken, whether or not you get invited to high-level strategic planning meetings, and then again, whether or not you think the PR function is valued within the organization, all of those things are higher in the case where you have some sort of tentacle into the senior executives. Okay, and this one, there's a lot in this slide as well. One of the things that we ask, that we've asked in GAPs for a long time, is how satisfied or how appropriate do you think your reporting structure is, right? And it will not shock you to find that people who report higher up are more satisfied. And it's, if you see that they're down at the bottom, it's a pretty big difference, right? Those who report into the C-suite are much more satisfied with the reporting structure. In addition, though, what we see is that I think people have believed for a while, off and on, that having multiple reports, having a function report multiple places might not be awesome, right? That you have many masters and that can be a problem. We actually see that people with multiple reports, and this has been true over a series of GAPs, are not less satisfied with the reporting structure. And a big reason for that is many times that second report is a report that gives you access into the C-suite. Okay? We'll also talk about this in a second when I talk about integration of functions within the organization. What I think we're seeing here is that in this time of rapid change, it can be very helpful to have tentacles into a variety of places in your organization. Okay. So overall, of course, the way your structure is set up and how you report will depend on the particulars of your organization. And I should say, for those particulars, we have online a data that's sort of sliced up by the very specific organization size and type. And if you want to know what the benchmarks are for your particular type of organization, follow that URL that Jerry gave you and have a look. But we see this across lots of GAPs, across other research that we've looked at, and certainly in this GAP, it's very important for the communication function to be part of what we've started to call the dominant coalition, what researchers call the dominant coalition, right? That's sort of that vertical power within the organization in order to be seen as a strategic counselor. Okay. So I want to show you a couple slides. We've talked a lot about whether or not you think the CEO values your contributions. I just want to show you what that looks like overall, right? Do people in general think the communication function is valued? And the answer is yes. The purpley, bluish, big bars are majorities answer. They strongly agree that they are invited frequently to senior level planning meetings and that they're taken seriously, right? Which we think is great. However, the research nerd in me urges you also to look at the sort of 30, 40-ish% who do not see, either don't see that they are valued or strongly disagree and are darn sure that they're not valued, right? And one of the analyses we're looking forward to doing, and we'd love to talk about with you guys, is trying to understand why that happens, right? What are the structural or circumstantial or industry type obstacles that get set up in the way of the PR function being valued within the organization? We see this even more, right, this sort of 44-ish% of those who don't think that the top-level management values the contribution of the PR function to the bottom line, right? So again, slight majority, 56%, strongly feel that they're valued, that their contributions to the bottom line are valued. But another large swath who don't. Okay. So finally, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about integration within the organization. And this is, by the way, something I knew very little about before I started working on the GAP. And in fact, what I knew about integration was always under this sort of idea of integrated marketing communication, right? In the sense of integrating a campaign or a voice across a series of channels or messages. That's not exactly what we're talking about here. What we're interested in is how well coordinated your communication functions are across the organization, and how well they're coordinated with the non-communication functions in the organization, like legal and information systems and things like that. So the first one of those we're calling intra-functional, and this is coordination among the different kinds of communication functions within your organization, right? And what we see, once again, on a 7-point scale, people tend to see that that they are fairly integrated overall, but in particular, those that are integrated, that do have integrated functions, communication functions in the organization, tend to be more successful across those measures that are probably becoming quite familiar to you, right? Being taken seriously, perceiving your function as being successful. We see the same thing when we look at how well coordinated the communication functions are with all of the other functions of the organization, right? Legal, HR, and information systems. And think of this as the playing nicely together variable. How well do the communication functions play with the other functions horizontally in the organization? And again, we see the more you do that, the more you play well, the better you are coordinated, the more successful that you seem to think you are across the board. Okay. It also happens to be the case that those organizations that are integrated in both those ways are also the organizations that tend to have PR functions that have access to the C-suite, right? So we're talking about sort of horizontal integration as well as this more vertical type of power. And so we thought, well, if that's nice, if one is nice and the other one is nice, perhaps it is nice to have them both. And in fact, it is. This thing we're calling the culture of integration, about 70% of the organizations that we talk to are integrated in both ways. Think that they're pretty darn integrated in both ways. Another swath are not, or are integrated in one way or not another. And what this slide, and this is the last one before I'll hand it over, what this slide with many things on it essentially says is that is awesome. To be integrated in both ways is more awesome than not to be, right? This, in my world, these are big jumps, right? From those organizations that are highly integrated in both ways, in terms of how seriously they feel their recommendations are taken, that's a full 2 points higher, right? And we've spent we're actually just working on a paper about this. We spent a lot of time thinking through why that is, right? And I think, and Jerry will speak to kind of pulling this all together in terms of best practices, but one of the things that we've started to talk about is as things change rapidly and as the kinds of strategic thinking that you're doing now are changing very rapidly, it's very important to have that kind of horizontal flexibility within the organization and be able to work well with a lot of different areas. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry for the summation. Thanks.
Thank you, Kjerstin. That was awesome. the awesome Kjerstin Thorson and the awesome Burghardt Tenderich I give you. So now we try to bring it all together. We try to synthesize this and talk about what it all means in terms of best practices. Now, it's not by accident that traditionally we've called this thing the generally accepted practices study rather than the best practices study, because to be something that's really best, you have to be able to prove that it's really good and better than the other options. So we've been kind of going along and talking about generally accepted practices studies, generally accepted practices for the most part. Now we're making a strong turn in the direction of best practices because we think the data are showing us what best practices really are. While we can't prove causality, we can't say that if you do these 3 things, these other 4 things are going to happen. There are some practices, some concepts in which the relationships between cause and effect, if you will, are pretty powerful. One of them is integration. As Kjerstin was saying, the better integrated the organization, generally speaking, the more successful the organization is going to be. And again, to emphasize, we're not talking about marketing communication. We're talking about cross-functional integration, collaboration that will often be driven by the communications function because we're in the best position to do it. In order to be successful, we as communicators must collaborate with our colleagues in other departments to know what's going on. So if the data exists that show that collaboration is a good thing, we're in the best position to drive it. So, best practice, champion intra-functional and inter-functional integration and coordination. A strong opportunity for the PR communications function. Next one. As you've seen about measurement and evaluation, invest at least, because certain types of measurement are associated with greater success. What you want to do is invest at least the average percentage of total budget in evaluation, but more importantly, invest in metrics other than and/or in addition to media outputs. Now, frankly, at some point soon we're going to just eliminate those words and/or in addition to, because we don't really believe in media outputs as an evaluation. It's just not supportable in the real world. But if you can spend on those things that demonstrate outcomes, using some of the tools that Kjerstin was talking about, you know, the online metrics and so forth, you can really do some pretty powerful evaluation and make a much stronger case for the function. So that's the second best practice that we're recommending. The third one, culture and character. You saw, as BT said, that character is usually driven by senior management, communications, and HR. And some people might wonder, why is HR there? It's because it's about the character of the employees and the way they work together to help establish the brand and how they represent the brand and how they champion the brand. HR plays a key role in that. So it's not just about brand, it's about a whole combination of things that together equal corporate character. Our recommendation, beginning within the PR communications function, champion the adoption of a culture or character that is proactive, long-term strategic, flexible, ethical, and people first. Now, you remember I showed you that slide early on with all those characteristics that we couldn't go into at the time? What we found is that those characteristics, when in place, are strongly associated with success. So you want to champion a culture that represents that. And again, we're in the ideal place to do that because we cut across functions. And we're the only function that does that. Next one, agency relationships. As BT touched on, there is a there are two different types of agency relationships. There's the tactical relationship and there's the strategic relationship. The tactical relationship is not associated with success. To the extent that, not nearly to the extent that, the strategic relationship is associated with success. The difference between the two is that on the tactical side, you're using agencies mostly for arms and legs. On the strategic side, you're using agencies primarily, not primarily, but in large measure, for insight, for guidance, for counsel, for objectivity, for point of view. And we could do a whole study, and we could be here all night talking about agency-client relationships, when they go right, when they go wrong. But this is a really important insight for both clients and for agencies. Lots to learn there and a lot to take advantage of. Then on reporting lines, assure that PR communication has the most effective reporting line given the nature and structure of the organization. In most cases, this will be a direct reporting line to the C-suite. You want to be part of the dominant coalition. That doesn't mean you don't have multiple reports, because as Kjerstin said, multiple reports can actually work, particularly in a matrixed organization where you're reporting into the C-suite and you also have some kind of a line somewhere else in the organization. And the totality of that is that you're part of the dominant coalition. That's where you want to be. So this whole thing about seat at the table and so forth, that's all great, but the majority of folks already do have the seat at the table. The question now becomes, how do you reach across the table to all of those other functions and create more of a collective, insightful, collaborative environment for the organization? And as it says down here in the bottom, we're looking very carefully at looking at drilling down on all of these things and really getting into the causality issues. A lot of really cool stuff here. The bottom line, last slide, the bottom line is that we believe, we see happening a transition from an old school to a new school. It is happening right now. Our students are going to be driving it and leading it. They're going to be in a position to make job decisions and career decisions about the type of organization, whether it's an old school or a new school organization. It's going to be pretty profound for them. When you look at the characteristics of the old school versus the new school, old school measurement of media outputs, they believe that the focus of the PR function is on media relations. They don't believe that social media are pervasive or will be pervasive. They tend to be more reactive and short-term, and they're really worried about control, which is not necessarily a great thing in this age of shifting control and so forth. That's the old school. The new school is looking at the measurement of outcomes, not outputs, but outcomes. They believe that social media belongs within the PR thing. And by the way, just an aside about this whole issue of control, the term control is kind of overused. We're not really talking about, I control social media, it will do what I say. What we're talking about is who is championing social media in the creation of social organizations. Which function is the best equipped to do that? And when you think about what marketing does versus what PR does, thinking that marketing is primarily sales-driven, PR is communications reputationally driven, it becomes pretty clear that control, in the sense that it's the champion of social media, should rest with the communications function. New school is long-term and strategic. It's not knee-jerk oriented. It embraces multiplying touch points, the pervasiveness of social media, but still with a modicum of control. Obviously, you're always trying to champion and achieve organizational goals, so you've got to have some degree of control over what you do. It can't be chaotic, but not to the same extent that the old school folks are thinking. And they're much more likely to believe that their recommendations are taken seriously by the most senior levels of the organization. Old school, new school, it's happening right now. I've seen it happening just in the course of my career. I've been doing this for 120 years. So, fini. And now what we would like to do, I'd like to have Kjerstin and Burghardt join me up here. we're going to have just a very brief conversation among ourselves about what really surprised us, and then we just want to get to your questions. It's now 8:25, so we'll get to questions sooner rather than later. And as we're sitting down, I'll tell you the thing that really surprised me the most was this whole issue of integration. It's amazing. The extent to which organizations benefit from more collaboration driven by communication is astonishing, because it argues for a whole different kind of organization, and it argues for a whole different type of function for the communications group. What really surprised you, Kjerstin?
Well, this is my first GAP, so actually the whole thing was very exciting for me. But I would have to say that I was surprised to see the jumps over time and how quickly organizations were engaging in a whole diverse variety of digital and social media practices.
Yeah, that to me, and then the very significant jump in measurement and evaluation was a big surprise, and as we've argued, probably a positive one.
Cool. How about some questions? Yeah.
I was wondering about the larger companies. I used to work at Rockwell, and I was surprised that some of the competing companies in the defense industry, they didn't take the PR function that seriously. They would bring people in from some related area and say, okay, you do PR.
Yeah.
And has the attitude changed? This was 30 years ago. Has the attitude changed? Do they go looking for highly trained, specialized people to plug into that department now? Or do they still reach for the garbage can and pick up what's left?
Ooh, oh, garbage can. BT, you want to take it?
Yeah, we didn't really ask this question per se, would be a great one. But there's some indicators that things have changed. And to me, a very telling one is that 75% of the leaders of the function have degrees and hence most likely a long-standing background in the communication function or journalism. So that would tell me that this is one indication that things have hopefully changed to the better in that regard.
Yeah, I'd agree also. But still, there are those companies, particularly Asian companies, that like to rotate people through all kinds of functions, so you don't really belong in any one, because they want you to be trained across many functions. That's a model that I think is really problematic. But in general, yeah, things have changed a lot for the better. Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, I'm a little confused on your last slide when you talked about the shift from looking at outputs to outcomes.
Yep.
I didn't understand the word outcomes and what that means. Could you translate?
Sure. Effects on audience, change, real influence, shifts in behavior, things that bring about action of some sort or a change in thinking. As opposed to, those would all be outcomes, as opposed to outputs, which are things like counting clips.
It's more qualitative.
It's more, yeah. And the thing that I hate the most, which is advertising equivalencies. Anybody who's been in my class has heard me curse advertising equivalencies. So it's the difference between measuring the stuff we put out there versus the impact that we have. Does that help?
I'm curious because I can't help but wonder if the rise in efforts to measure outcomes has been spurred by an awareness of trying to quantify what you can do in social media. Because I don't think we really did much of any of that 10 years ago in looking at outcomes in more traditional PR. There wasn't really a good way to put numbers on it. There weren't good tools to do that. But now you have good tools to measure social media. I'm wondering if that's sort of driven an awareness. Maybe we ought to look at everything else. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, social media is up, but so is primary research of all kinds. So I think that it's not just that it's gotten easier to measure social, it's gotten easier to measure your impact in every way. I mean, we always knew how to do it. It was just very expensive and time-consuming and specialized, right? But now it's not that much harder to measure an actual increase in audience awareness than it is to keep an eye on your clip count, right? Because you can actually be out there with not too expensive panels of important audience members. So I think it's both.
And maybe adding to this, it could also be that senior management doesn't really care how many news releases you put out, or hopefully doesn't care how many articles you have. They keep asking and have kept asking for, show us real contribution to bottom line results. And Bob, to your question earlier about some of the KPIs, we did ask about financial KPIs, so contribution to share price, contribution to revenue, and potentially a couple of others which I can't think of. Yeah, revenue, yeah. So I think we're seeing a little bit of a shift there, that companies that take PR more seriously don't ask for how many news releases, they ask for outcomes.
The problem is sometimes folks will talk about KPIs, right? But they'll say they do it, but then if you drill down, you say, okay, what exactly do you do to measure that? It's nothing there. Nothing there. Yeah?
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating question. And it was just mentioned that it's getting easier to measure the qualitative outcomes. But unless you're talking about sales or something like that, how do you do it? How is it getting easier?
I don't think it's not getting easier to measure your impact on the bottom line. It's getting easier to measure PR outcomes, right, in the sense of increased awareness or people who read your thing actually went to the store. Those things are easier to measure. I think this is a very exciting moment for people who are interested in connecting those things to actual money outcomes. And the reason for that is because if you can count, for me, how much your campaign impacted awareness, and you can tell me sales and all the other stuff that's happening in your organization, we can run models that will help you quantify to sort of the, we can give you a little number that says this was your impact. But we can't do that unless we know all the other stuff, right?
As a researcher, that's easy. Are there any tools out there for the practitioner?
Sure. There are all kinds of online survey tools. It's like all of the wonderful, sophisticated stuff that's always been done in political campaigns, right? It's all available to us now at no cost. So there's a tendency to think automatically in terms of sales, moving a product, and all of that. But sometimes if you're a company that's trying to build a plant, or if you're a company that's trying to get a piece of legislation, or a group that's trying to get a piece of legislation passed, or something like that, you're interested in changes in behavior, changes in opinion, changes in point of view. And that can be much more easily measured now using things like Qualtrics. Any one of our brilliantly trained students who know how to do survey research, go out and hire a bunch of them. And, all of those wonderful techniques are now available to us and are being used by us.
But it's not magic, right? I mean, you kind of have to moneyball PR, right? There are other places that they count everything they do, and every time an impact occurs, right? And maybe we haven't thought too much about how we count how many home. I should never enter into a sports analogy. It's a terrible place for me to go. But I do think, it's not about just using one tool, right, or pressing a magic button. I think you have to really think about becoming an organization that measures yourself all the time, and then find people who know how to put those measures together in a way that comes out with something that you might like 6 or 12. But we can't do that unless we measure ourselves all the time, kind of in a lot of different ways.
And again, because of the increase in percent of budget spent on evaluation, we're beginning to see that happen.
I think that, with budgets the way they are, of course, we don't have the money that we used to have. It all speaks directly to return on the investment, ROI. You have to prove that what you're doing is the right thing and it's making a difference in one way or another.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. And then what happens is you might be getting your budget cut a little bit, but if you invest a little bit more in the right kind of research, right, and you champion the kind of stuff we've been talking about, there will be results, right? And then the money comes, and the money comes from marketing, right? A bunch of questions. Yeah.
Another question, a couple questions on the percentage of the percentage of public relations expenditures compared to the corporate revenue, like a 20%.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, in government, but also how that compared to government and the other sectors.
It's a great question. The question was, how do you, remember we showed you the PR-GR relationship, the relationship between gross revenue and communication expenditure? This is a tool we've been working on for years because we believe that ultimately it'll work. We're now seeing that it does work with larger corporations because we're seeing the consistency from gap to gap with large companies in what we used to call the PR-GR ratio. We haven't seen it yet for government agencies and haven't seen it yet for nonprofits. So it's not a tool that...
But there's no revenue, right? I mean...
Yeah, how do you look at revenue? Is it gross budget? Is it...
if you have the gross sales, I work for a city utility, so I know what our overall budget is, and you can look at the PR and say, okay, this is what we spent on.
Yeah, so you look at total budget, right? And then you look at PR expenditure as a percentage of that as opposed to revenue.
But that's, for a utility, that doesn't make any sense though, because a utility is how many people moved in and need electricity. And you're not driving them with PR, you're telling them how to save money maybe. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, a lot of things you're doing are designed to like reduce demand or other things.
Yeah, it would have to really be category specific.
Yeah. We have 4 million people that are customers, and you want to communicate with them as to your policies, your rates, lots of stuff to talk about, and as well as conservation. And so, you know, when everybody in the city, including everybody in the city, is your customer,
Yeah.
you don't have to worry so much about sales. You have a lot of stuff to talk about.
This is the classic research question about what's the sample. It's like we'd have to look only at utilities that provide comparable services and of comparable size before we could come up with something resembling a PR-GR ratio. You couldn't compare it to the Red Cross or any nonprofit or a government agency. You couldn't. It's a category unto itself, which is an interesting challenge. We could do that. Give us a grant.
That's right. We're for sale.
Go for the sale.
The other question I had was in reporting, and I've been at Water College 35 years, so I've gone through all the different machinations, is that sometimes reporting directly to the top guy, sometimes in the intermediates, whatever. And we've had periods where, right now in a situation where the person in charge of government relations, we report to them. Although now they've got the environmentalist and environmental parts to it, kind of weird. So the question I was wondering, I don't remember seeing, maybe I missed it, on the different sections within public relations, whether corporate or whatever, I don't recall seeing an item about government relations or the groups that have a relationship with the elected officials. I didn't see that as a category unless that's considered public affairs.
We do have that actually. That slide just doesn't show everything, but either email us or go into that Insight database, and we have many, many more slides on government agencies and their organization and their responsibilities. So we did kind of,
In terms of the reporting structure.
Take a look at the stuff that's online.
I'm actually glad you bring this up because this, believe it or not, is only a small subset of our findings, and we'd be literally here all night. So this is what the GAP Insight base is for, where you can find very specific data. It's all available for free on the website.
For free.
Stefan?
For the time being, while it lasts, while supplies last.
I don't know much about the marketing product PR numbers.
By the way, this is our longtime and excellent adjunct, Stefan Pollack, who's raising a question here.
Either validate or maybe comment on my hunch. My hunch is that the reason for the decline is because corporations have reallocated budget to saving their reputations during this time of turmoil. So therefore, they spend less money marketing products and spend more money saving their corporations.
I think that's a very interesting hypothesis. I mean, that could be an explanation. Yeah, when we hadn't discussed as much.
It'll be interesting to see if this movement that we're seeing has legs.
Right.
And we'll.
CSR at all, and that stuff, and where that sits?
it's lower on the list. I didn't make the top 10
Yeah,
as a responsibility.
Yeah.
When they no longer have to protect the corporation as aggressively as they've had to, you'll see that number change.
Maybe, maybe not. We think old school, new school, right? We think that even when times are good, when the economy is back, we're still going to see some very fundamental changes where organizations are going to increasingly realize that PR is where it's at. PR broadly defined. Something we didn't get to talk about was the increasing extent to which PR is involved in consumer relations. Because who are the people calling? When a consumer has a problem, what does that contact look like? It used to be the 800 number that went into the call center, that went into customer service. Where's it going now? It's coming to us.
Social media.
Social media.
Social media. It's coming to the PR people.
The PR person's answering the Twitter feed. So
Right, exactly. Exactly. So that's a change that's not going to retreat. That's going to expand.
I'm particularly interested in the slides about the PR people's contribution to the financial success of the corporation. And I'm just curious, in your original survey.
Is that you, Charlie?
Yes.
This is Charlie Gu, who graduated from our program how many years ago?
3.
3 years ago. Nice to see you.
And I just, I remember, if I remember correctly, there seems a majority of respondents reported that they feel that they have contributed, to the financial success of the organization. And I'm just curious, in your survey, what questions did you ask them to quantify responses as being contributive to the financial success? And the second question is there in the future GAP studies any plan to maybe to survey the C-suite people? How about their perceptions on the other side? Look at whether the PR people actually do contribute versus the PR people's perception for that.
Yeah, absolutely, especially if you're paying for it.
The thing is, we could do, I mean, it's so rich. Yeah. It has no end, right?
But we asked 4 or 5 different questions, and yes, that's exactly a problem for us, is that we ask about how you perceive that you're valued, right? So we asked about financial success overall, asked a couple specific questions about the bottom line, and then in general about how seriously you think you're taken. Now, one interesting thing is, though, in the 80s, the IABC paid for a very big study that, actually not as big as, actually, I should stop talking about, not as big as this study. They paid for a study where they surveyed PR practitioners, and then for a slice of them, they interviewed their CEOs, and they actually found that the CEOs valued the function more than the PR people thought they did. So I was kind of surprised. You would think that it would be all rosy, that everyone would say, I'm a huge contributor, but actually there's quite a lot of variation. People do seem to understand, I think somewhat accurately, able to perceive their value within the organization.
And plus, PR people are modest by nature.
At the beginning, you talked about benchmarks and budgets, and I'm just curious if you found any guideline of a percentage to say, here's the revenues your company is making, here is the percentage that your PR budget should be.
That's where we're going with PRGR ratio, or PRGR relationship. And we think we've got it nailed for big companies. If you're a Fortune 500 company, we think we've got it nailed. We think we can advise you. It was up on the slide.
0.04%.
0.04% of gross revenue.
Is average.
That's average. That's not necessarily optimal. Something we should look at is the relationship between PRGR ratio and success.
So,
right?
Yeah, I think that's a much more interesting question.
Yeah. But at least it's a place to start. It's an answer to the question that Steve Harris raised 10 years ago. What's the benchmark, right?
So really what you guys have done is you said what's sort of the standard practice, and then the next question is that the effective practice?
Is it the best practice? Is it the most effective practice? That's where we're going now. Questions?
Is there any concern for social responsibility and also...
Not at all. Nah, not at all. I'm sorry. Serious. Go ahead.
I didn't hear you mention that in particular specifically, but I know that both goodwill and social responsibility at one time had quantitative, values plugged into the system. And it was, an overall company responsibility, but the public relations function had a core responsibility for seeing that this actually happened.
So we asked that question. We basically looked at whether corporate social responsibility, how highly it ranked as a core responsibility for corporations, and it scored fairly low. Fairly low. And what a possible explanation is, if you look at the trend in CSR over the last 10 years, many corporations, especially public ones, have established standalone CSR organizations. So it may be just that the function of CSR and the overall investment in CSR has increased, but it's not necessarily, that investment has not necessarily gone to the PR function, because we've only asked about PR.
Could it have also declined because their money's tight and they're focused on different things? Say 2007, 2009 gaps, that was a much bigger deal than maybe it is in 2011, given what they've gone through the last 3 years.
It didn't decline, it just didn't.
Yeah, just looking at totally unrelated, GAP unrelated studies, investment in CSR seems to have increased pretty consistently. Okay, Laura.
This is our awesome adjunct, Laura Jackson, by the way.
I think you could take a ratio operating budget. So it wouldn't really matter how large a constituent group would be, and this way you could measure NGOs. That way you don't have to necessarily measure against fundraising. Right? You have an operating budget.
Among nonprofits.
Among any organization. Any category. So I'm sorry to add another level of complexity and analysis.
No, I really have a headache. Yeah, we could do that. No, we could do that. Yeah, by the way, this is really important. If you have recommendations, if you have suggestions for how this thing can be improved, let us know. It's a work in progress, believe me. Other questions? Yeah.
It seems that the curriculum that the journalism school is focused on, at least in my classes, has been based off of the accepted principles from the GAP study. My question to you is, does Annenberg take, or USC take, any role in the broader spectrum of academia with trying to spread this to other institutions? I know that Annenberg and USC, of course, is the most awesome of those institutions. But for the public relations...
You heard that?
He's
awesome.
Totally paid for that.
Yeah,
Too.
yeah.
But for the public relations field as a whole, is there any outreach done by the school to make sure that other institutions are also teaching these?
We just finished a paper on Sunday. Yeah.
So the answer is yes. As Kjerstin said, we've already written, she has, we as a team have already written 2 papers on this, submitted 2 papers. We're also speaking at an academic summit in June, which will be attended by about 100 academics in the PR field. And through the partner organizations, we will continue to publish findings, and basically we'll continue to PR the findings in order to maximize visibility for it.
Remember what we said at the beginning, we want to lead the change. We're going to be doing a Skype, not a Skype, but a conference, a web-based conference for all PRSA members. What is it, in 3 weeks? Something like that, through our partnership with PRSA. So every PRSA member in the universe will be able to see the presentation. Yeah, yeah.
I know there was a slide, I'm trying to remember, where there was communication, like it was like 50%, and marketing was like 40%. Was that on
social media?
Social media.
Sounds like social media.
Social media. I know that like PR itself is gaining more attention, is gaining more value in the company itself, and I'm just curious to see, like, since PR is getting more attention and is becoming more valuable to the company and to the company's image, that if in the future you see that PR will take over any functions of, say, marketing in the future, do you think that we're gaining that much momentum, or the company's kind of seeing us more as the face and like in other? I know that you talked about how PR is good. You know, it has influence in other sections of the company, and we're the only company that or not company, but the only function that goes through all the different sectors. So I'm just curious to see what you guys have to say about that.
So, if we had to speculate, I think we're only at the very beginning of what's going to be called the social enterprise. And it started, if you like, within PR, because PR kind of jumped onto the whole social media thing early. We've seen a massive uptake by marketing in the last couple of years. The next major push is going to be social customer relationship management, meaning that the sales organization, the pre-sales organization is going to get involved. We see social in product development. We see social now as a major tool within organizations as a communication mechanism. To answer your question, I think it's completely up in the air who's going to prevail on this. It may be PR, maybe not, or it may even lead to a redefinition of all these various corporate functions.
If you want to follow one company, follow IBM. If you want to look at what one company is doing, look at what a guy named John Iwata is doing at IBM. John rose up, he was an engineer. He then rose up through, he went through technical communication. He then got into the communication department, the Corp Comm department. And he is now head of all global communication and marketing for IBM. It is becoming almost a total social organization in which they do brainstorming globally among their employees using social tools. They do these things, what are they called, like mashup? They're not mashups, they're like, I forget. Go to the IBM website.
They did a global volunteerism thing.
Yeah, just look at everything you can learn about IBM and watch it very closely. They're brilliant, brilliant. Yeah.
Well, it seems to me, I'm curious if your research has shown you this, that you are seeing much more of a smearing of categories between marketing, PR, and advertising in particular, because those are all really communicating about studies are showing any of that, or what do you think about?
I don't think we've really asked that question. And
it's hard too because we're talking to PR people, right? So given the global all things survey, if we could get in there and look at some of these questions across those functions rather than the PR take on what's happening with those functions, I don't know what would be.
Where? Yes, Jackie?
They have money too.
Questions from other folks? Yeah.
Jackie.
I'm curious about the
Jackie, is that you? Yeah. Hi, Jackie.
I'm curious about the idea of CSR and how it's scored so low. So is it mostly because of these budget restrictions, or do you think there's like an underlying question of whether CSR should even be under PR?
I personally think it is an expansion of CSR and a trend towards establishing designated CSR organizations within companies. So I wouldn't say away from PR, but just a more concerted and also more strategic investment. So what started as a nice to have for a company really seems to be moving for a number of reasons, some of them being regulatory, really moving more towards the forefront, and therefore investment increases, but in a different and new organization within the company. That's my take on it.
I have a question regarding going back to the social media, because and first of all, I do believe social media 100% belongs in the realm of public relations because they're both relationship-based. But given that, did your research look at all at the where the relationship is through the social media? Is it with the brand and the company, or is it with the employee and the practitioner? I mean, because I know there's a
key
lot
question.
of legal issues right now over where is the relationship and who is it with and how is it controlled.
Yeah.
Did you look at that at all, or is that in the...
Not specifically, no. But, if you step back and you look at it kind of conceptually, if you look at the nature of the relationship between the organization and its stakeholders based on social media, one fundamental question you have to ask is, what is the purpose of the relationship? If it is to sell, near term, to drive, quarter-to-quarter numbers, that's one kind of relationship, and it suggests something very specific about the nature of the relationship and where it belongs. If, on the other hand, the goal is to build a sustainable kind of network of stakeholders who are more positively inclined toward your products and services but may not run out and buy it that day, that says something else about the relationship. It's a very different kind of engagement. So, and different to me, it's like old school, new school again, but it's a social media view of old school, new school. Old school will look at social media as a way to sell. New school will look at social media as a way to engage.
And one of the limits where GAP stops is because the survey is focused on how the function works within the organization. We don't know as much about how we know if you're using it, but we don't know exactly how you're using social media. But there is a lot of other research out there on this topic that academics have been doing, and a clear conclusion is that most organizations, most of the time, are still using even social media for broadcast rather than for interaction with the various public. So it's a nice complement.
It's one to many still.
Yeah. One to a smaller, more select many, but still
very much so.
It's not very social.
No.
It's not social in the sense you'd want to get invited back, but it's kind of social.
It's a monologue versus a dialogue. That's it's a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Questions somewhere back here? Yes, please.
In terms of the application of findings to public relations education, are there some specific things that are, or some specific applications that you can make to curriculum? I mean, some of this is not, for those of us who have kind of revised our curriculum.
Where do you teach?
I teach public relations in Pepperdine.
Great. Oh, good school. Good school. Nice view.
Yes. But I'm wondering, a lot of these things we've already incorporated into our revised curriculum, but are there some specific applications from these findings that you'll be sharing with, with the broader academy, or just some specific specific changes you think that should result should be implemented as a result of the findings?
That's your curriculum, Jerry.
Oh. Well, we're about to hopefully publish these papers that talk all about that, that talk about the curricular implications, that talk about the academic implications. But I'll just share with you an exercise that we went through not too long ago in light of everything we were learning and the way the world was going. We basically tore apart our undergraduate curriculum. We stripped it right down to the ground and acted as if we were starting fresh. And with no preconceived notions about what courses were good, what courses were bad, it didn't matter. Strip it down to the ground and rebuild. And it's as much about process as it is about content. So A, yeah, we're going to be sharing these findings with the academic world, but then B, the big issue is, what do you do with them? How locked into you how are you with a traditional way of looking at things? What does a university enable you to do? And the more they'll let you do, the further you go with it.
And a lot of these findings, I think, have kind of trailing off. I mean, it's not solely, hey, everyone's producing videos, so we need to teach you how to produce videos, although that's really important. But we spent a lot of time talking about things like, in a social world, how does our theoretical approach to understanding the function change? And things like, do we teach social networks? Do we teach people how to understand how influence changes in a world where things are networked rather than top down? And I think so that's a lot of this kind of stuff that we've talked about, is that a lot of that, it doesn't necessarily upheave what the top level bucket looks like theory or making stuff, but it fundamentally changes what's in that bucket, I think.
Does that help?
Yeah, I work in the defense industry. And
the what industry, I'm sorry?
Defense. And we do use social media, it seems, more for broadcast than for really building the relationship. You're not going to go out and buy a missile or a airplane. But then I struggle with saying, what is the right relationship I should be trying to achieve? So I'm just, spreading information. I mean, it is a vehicle for getting the word out. We do a lot of unmanned aircraft, which are becoming more and more, drones, if you will,
cool.
Which are becoming more controversial about how smart they are. But I still struggle with how best to use the tool. I feel like I'm just kind of doing the simplest things and not really exploiting the tools.
So a recommendation would be really, as a first step, and obviously I have no idea what your organization currently does in social, but really as a first step, listening. So establishing a listening post, working with a social media monitoring tool, and setting it up in a way that you get a very, very good understanding about how your brand, your products, drones, whatever it may be, are being discussed in social media, how maybe some of your competitors or how certain issues that for whatever reason are really key to your business are being discussed in social media. And that insight, that analysis will probably guide you, give you some input towards the type of social media program you want to build.
Also, you need to take Kjerstin was talking a minute ago about networks. You want to look at influencers. You're not talking to everybody. You might be talking to 20 people. And the trick is to do some network mapping and take a look at where these folks are and engage with them.
On the one hand,
and you're going to get an invoice for that, by the way.
A small number of people in terms of who will buy the product, but
who will influence the people who will buy the product?
The bottom line is, every consumer out there has a congressman who they can say, you know what, we're spending too much or not enough on this.
Right. Right.
So there's
right.
You've got a public. Like cops are getting into the drone market too. So that's almost a whole new universe.
Yeah.
Unmanned drones and stuff. A lot of those are starting to buy these things.
Yeah. I'm going to get one. Yeah.
Last question.
Watch your students.
Occupy Wall Street. I was part of Occupy DC. I've been out in the field checking on them. You have different Occupy things, 1% versus 99%. Is there any concern from your perspective about how this is going to affect
That's a great question.
Overall function?
That's a great question. What do you think?
Corporate America.
Great question. What do you think?
I don't know if we're going to debate about this. So this is actually what I study. So I'm very interested in social movements and how they're using digital and social media. And I think there's been some remarkable evidence about how rapidly public opinion can change now, right? And how rapidly an issue that wasn't talked about before, like about banks or just about this sort of corporate fuzzy problem, can get up there real high. But I'm not sure that I feel like it's been very successful in targeting any specific organizations. And I think that'll be interesting to watch in terms of whether we live in a time where we distrust most authority sources, not just corporations, but government as well. And so I'm not sure this is a sea change in the credibility of corporate organizations.
Final question.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Questions?
So we're getting one final question.
Yeah, it's late, 9 o'clock, 9:05. Yeah.
I have a question regarding the budget, because I can see like the social media has got quite attention from the corporate side, and also at the same time, like I see like there's a raise in the budget for public relations. However, I wonder, is that like a budget especially for the social media section, or like corporate they want to do something on the social media tools and to make use of that? That's why they increase the budget for PR. Just like the way when PR was like independent from marketing section, the marketing department now become the PR department. Would that be possible in the future? That would be like social media.
Well, I think what the data show, though, it's not that money is being taken from PR and moved into social. It's one pot. PR is being asked to do social with no additional revenue, with no additional budget.
There's no relationship between how much digital social you do and whether or not your budget went up.
Yeah.
I know, like, because you see like a decrease in marketing and increase in public relations. Then I wonder, is that like the money specifically allocated to social media in doing public relations?
If Matthew Levesque were here, what he would say, Matthew Levesque teaches our new media courses. What he would say is it's a mistake to isolate the social media budget from other communications budgets. You have to look at you have to look at the totality of your campaign. And you don't isolate social from traditional, from legacy media, from whatever you have to do. It's one strategy, one budget that needs to be fully integrated. So it's not either or. Does that help? I'm not sure. We'll talk about it afterwards. Yeah, Charlie.
I'm particularly interested.
Last question, by the way.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm particularly interested in social activism on social media, and I think one good example that just occurred to me is that the popular of Kony 2012 and then online.
See, the three of us, we should all go hang out because I'm totally interested in this as well. Yeah.
And it's to me that I was curious to see what your guys take as a public relations professional about how the popularity of like Kony 2012 and an incident like that today, as a matter of fact, any person or a consumer can go online, use social media, and create a campaign and become viral overnight.
No, it's not overnight. This is a really important point, right? And this goes to this idea about social networks. We have a couple of people here at USC who've been studying the organization of invisible children, which has actually been around for about a decade, and they have spent most of that decade building a network, right? And if you go online, you can find a bunch of different network analyses that show that video didn't go viral. It was sent out to a very well understood set of publics that were highly networked through social media, as well as some already identified celebrity influencers. And what happened is that was done. That didn't happen overnight. They built that for years, right? And I think a really important takeaway from that is if we don't understand that going viral is not just something magic that happens because you make a video that's all woohoo. You also have to understand that that's organization that's built over time, right? And it doesn't just go viral. It goes viral because you worked something out of it.
Yeah. That's a really important insight. It's like, which comes first, the network or the content, right? And the answer is, we think, the network.
Yeah, well, unless you have some really crazy video with a kid biting a dog, in which case all bets are off, right? But you can't plan that.
You can't kittens dancing or something.
I think there are many exceptions to what I just said.
Cats juggling dogs, something. Yeah. All right. Oh, I think we're done unless somebody has a really dynamite last question. Is it a dynamite question?
Oh,
is it?
That's hard.
All right. What is it?
I'm sorry. It'll be short.
Okay.
Going on ahead, segregation you said, Matthew, that is not possible to dissect social media budget from the other budgets.
Yeah.
Is it because social media promotion cannot be measured yet? Is that the reason why?
No, it's true because you need a single point of view. You need if you're going to have a highly focused brand, if you're going to have a highly focused point of view, a highly focused reputation, you need to speak with one voice. We teach that all the time. You speak with one voice across all platforms. You're not necessarily conveying the same messages to all audiences, although these days you really have to because they tend to meld together. But you want to make sure that everything you do is consistent. So what you do in social can't be different really from what you do in the daily newspaper. Make sense? Okay. It was an awesome question. And with that, let's call it a night. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.